Mike Larson just gave a really presentation about forest wildlife habitat needs. And now we're going to dig into a little bit about Minnesota forest habitat types, past, present, and future. Mark Nelson with U.S. Forest Service is on next.
It's my privilege to be speaking to you today about Minnesota's forest habitat types, past, present, and future. This is a tag team effort. I'll be leading off for the first half and then tag off to Howard Hoganson for the second half. I'll focus more on the past and present conditions, and Howard will take us from present to future with some nifty modeling results that he will show. My conclusion is that habitat type does not equal habitat. Any questions? Actually, I'm playing off of Mike Larson's previous talk, and he went into some detail about habitat. I want to just reiterate that because sometimes we talk past each other as wildlife biologists, as foresters, and we may say habitat and mean different things. So let's just take a quick look at what we as wildlife biologists might mean. We refer to habitat as resources or conditions that promote occupancy by a given organism. So as Mike said, it's specific to a species or even a population within a species. But when we talk about habitat types, that's a more general notion referring to vegetation associations, either existing or potential. We might also interpose that with forest types or with cover types. So what that really means is they're not necessarily the same thing. So today the focus is on habitat types, and so I've actually changed the title from what's shown in your program, which refers to habitats, but in fact we're talking in this presentation about habitat types more generically in terms of vegetation types, not specific to the individual species, as Mike already did the groundwork for that. Much of my talk today is based on the Forest Inventory and Analysis Program as part of the U.S. Forest Service, and here we see the location of those sample plots that are forested in Minnesota. These are permanent plots remeasured every 5 years. And that data is made available every year, as are a number of tools. I'll be using the EVALIDATOR today, which allows you to produce various statistical estimates. Here's a quick example by forest stand age. Are the columns 20-year age classes by various forest inventories. We can do this for a whole host of forest composition and structural attributes, as well as things such as ownership and other characteristics of our forests. And in addition to releasing the data every year, we put out these annual reports. Scott Hillard with Minnesota DNR is now our FIA state analyst, and he's actually presenting later this morning in another session, State of Minnesota Forests. So if you want to learn more detail, a comprehensive look at forests beyond the habitat context, you could go to that session, but I encourage you to stay in this session. In general, we see that our forest resources, the total area of forest at least, has been increasing in recent years, now topping over 17.7 million acres. And similarly, the area of timberland, which represents productive forest that's not reserved, it's not a wilderness area like the Boundary Waters or Voyageurs National Park, has also been increasing. About 1/3 of our state is forested, but it's not evenly distributed spatially. Here we see that in the northeast, the Arrowhead, over 75% of these ecological subsections are forested, whereas in the south and western portion of the state, less than 5% of those subsections are in forest land. Similarly, the distribution of ownership is not even spatially. Top left, that private shows that the southern portion is dominated by private ownership. Over 75% in the bright red. County local is more in that north central portion of the state. The state ownership predominates in the northern sections, and federal in the northeast, which corresponds to national forests and parks. Similarly, forest composition and structure is not homogeneous across our state. Here we're looking at forest stand age, 0 to 20 years. And what pops out for me is if you look at southeastern Minnesota in that driftless area, less than 5% of those subsections is in forest that's what we might call early successional forest, 0 to 20. but we see some hotspots in the central and northern portions of the states where we have 25 to 50% in that darkest orange is in that youngest age class. The 21 to 50 and the 51 to 80 year age classes reveal that much of our forest is in those intermediate age classes, and greater than 80, less prevalent and somewhat heterogeneous in its distribution as well. In addition to looking at the spatial heterogeneity, we can look at temporal heterogeneity. Mike referred to spatial and temporal aspects. So we'll continue that theme here. Of course, our major forest type groups are aspen, birch, spruce fir, hickory, and the others listed there. And we can look at trends over time. For example, we can see that there appears to be a downward trend in the abundance of aspen, birch, and spruce fir. This is for timberland area, which allows us to compare to older FIA data when we did not collect data on all forest land. So this excludes areas like the Bower Waters and national parks. Oak hickory appears to be increasing, but if we change just a bit our temporal scale, and say for spruce fir, you can see that it has been decreasing overall, but in more recent years it's actually increasing over time. So this emphasizes the importance of matching the scale of both temporal and spatial effects on the questions of interest.
Wisconsin and Michigan.
So if total forest land area is increasing, but some forest type groups are decreasing, what's going on?
So if we look at
Here I'm showing you two examples. The first for aspen birch, where we can compare two recent inventories. Time 1 is represented by the rows from 2008 to 2012, and time 2 by the columns 2013 to 2017. And in the far right column, we see that the net change in forest, you can't read this, so I'll tell you the number, 163,000 acres of net loss of aspen birch across the state between those 2 to 5 year increments. Where does it come from? Where does it go? Much of the aspen birch is lost to spruce fir, but there's also gains from spruce fir. However, the net gains are outweighed by the net losses, as we have a decline. If we flip it to spruce fir, we see the opposite effect. In the far right column here, the net gain is about 200,000 acres of spruce fir between these two periods. And again, there are these transitions between aspen and birch for gains and losses. Here, the gains outweigh the losses, so there's a net increase. We can do this for any of these forest types or type groups, as well as many other structural and compositional classes. This provides an example of how we can look at the transitions and where things are coming from, where they're going to. To make life a little more complicated, we combine things with more attributes of interest. Here, we're looking at aspen forest in 10-year age classes combined with ownership. So what pops out is that these top bars are blue here, representing county, and the bottom ones in the dark orange for state, show that the distribution of aspen is more skewed towards the younger age classes. And the green bars here for federal land and the lighter tan for private show that that distribution moves a little bit into the older classes, as Mike pointed out in his presentation. Now, when there's much interest in the abundance of early successional forest, which are usually defined as 0 to 20 years of age, and our forests regenerate following some disturbance. It could be some intentional practice that we have, harvesting timber that FIA refers to as cutting in this lower red portion of the stacked graph, or it could be from natural disturbances such as fire or wind, which is represented by the blue portion of the stacked graph. So what's important to note here is that we don't have any control over these natural disturbances, but yet we should account for them, because in some years, up to 40% of that disturbance, in other words, 40% of the regeneration of early successional forest could be due to natural disturbances. In other years, it might be only about 10%. So as we think holistically about managing habitat, we think about what we can do, but we should also remember what we can't do, what we don't control, and what the uncertainties are with those things.
was produced.
So let's touch just a little bit about early successional forest. That was one of the early interests of this collaborative. It's no longer the only interest, but it's still an important one, and it illustrates a good point. So if we look at trends in the abundance of early successional forest since the early 2000s up to the present, we see that it has increased from about 1.7 to about 1.8 million acres in aspen birch. So if we like early successional dependent wildlife species, that looks like good news. However, if we zoom in a bit more temporally, in other words, we break down that 0 to 20 into 5-year age increments, we see a different pattern emerge. Let's start with this line, which represents
Just want to point out,
the 0 to 5-year age class. Actually, in pretty sharp decline over recent years, losing about 200,000 acres.
At the top,
This line, this orange-looking line, represents the older end of that age spectrum, 16 to 20, which is increasing. So you can see that there's the shifting pattern within 0 to 20 that illustrates that in the short term, some other things are going on. So again, this illustrates the importance of matching the scale of your analysis to the questions of interest. So I've given just a few outlines as the warm-up band to Howard Hoganson, who will be coming up next, to illustrate that we have an increasing area of timberland and forest land in the state. There's uneven spatial distribution of our forest resources, function, composition and structure, and that there's generally more older forest on private and federal, and more young on state and county local lands. And this last example about the increasing early succession, but yet that's not necessarily true if we look at a shorter time frame. So now I'll hand off, the tag team off to Howard, you can take it forward from here.
That wasn't my idea. Thank you. I guess what I'd like to do today is just briefly talk about 3 different studies I've been involved in that's related to, think of integrating wildlife, looking at timber supply over time, realizing that, yeah, predicting the future, we can't do that. Yet we can look ahead and just try to better understand what some of the potential outcomes might be. In all of my presentations here, all of the studies, we've really, it's been a team approach. I'm talking about it today, but there's been others involved. You'll see those names on some of the slides. I don't want to take credit for it, and if there's something that's really looks bad, I can turn around and let them have it and say, oh, is that right? But in general, the first one I'd like to talk about is we've done a fair amount of work in the last few years trying to go back and look at revisiting some of the analysis of the Minnesota GEIS. The GEIS was done back, what was it, 15 or 25 years ago now. And the idea then was we were looking at a situation where timber harvesting was increasing. We were concerned about can our forest sustain this? What about impacts on wildlife? How do we look at opportunities in more of a statewide all lands perspective? In that work, we did a lot. We did a lot of analysis, a lot of other additional papers. Here, what we've done in this sort of what we're calling draft is we've just taken sort of this core model that projected the forest out over time and looked at conditions now as if we would try to look forward to starting today with something like a GIS analysis. And when you go back and look at the GIS, it was not a predictive model. It was idea to look at different futures. They looked at a base scenario where harvest levels stayed steady, the lower line there, and looked at harvest levels all the way up to as high as 7 million gourds a year. Well, where are we today? Today, we're at a level of about 3 million gourds. Not even, well below the baseline scenario back at the time of the GIS. So one can think, well, geez, why are we even worried about timber supply anymore? What's there to be concerned about? Well, it comes back to differences between species, differences between what mills desire, and when we look at that resource, the cover type or the species of concern today really seems to be aspen, So in our initial draft runs of this, we looked at aspen supply, wondering, can we really look at increasing and look at more mills in Minnesota that might depend very heavily on aspen. So here in this graph, all I'm showing is a series of shadow prices for different levels of output, taking aspen at its current level of about 1.5 million and raising it just by about 100,000 cores, looking at what happens to our ability to sustain this harvest level over time. In this kind of process, shadow prices are really just showing us the signal of how much is it costing us to try to achieve this outcome. And what we end up happening is higher shadow prices are going to really show inability to sustain that level over time. We end up having planting periods competing with each other just as well as we have timber markets or different locations competing. So as we did this little analysis, we found that we don't have all that much flexibility or room for increasing aspen wood supply over time here. I like to use the term in class when I've talked about this as hitting the wall. I'm not sure I should be using that term anymore, but when we look at it, all of a sudden we can raise those harvest levels, and all of a sudden they skyrocket and get to a point where we've got problems to meeting the supply. This analysis was also done with a lot of assumptions about, willingness of all landowners to contribute to this aspen supply. And we know that's not true. With that, we can look at species or tree species, or think of cover types and how those are changing over time. Here, we just track the amount of aspen over age 55 under this highest level scenario where we hit the limit. And by gosh, look at how much both the area of aspen cover type over 55 crashes over time on both timberland and when we look at the total forest land and timberland. So looking ahead, there are concerns about wood supply, even when we can step back and think, it's dropped so much since at the time of the GES or in really the last 10 years. We've seen a pretty big drop in the amount of wood harvested. Another study I'd like to talk about, this is a little older, but I think it's a really good one. I was fortunate to be involved with the forest planning process in both national forests in Minnesota. There, put quite a bit of emphasis on multi-resource. What I'd like to just highlight out of that work was some of the stuff we did with spatial arrangement of the forest. There, that forest planning team looked at wildlife concerns and the aspect that they came up with that they really wanted us to try to incorporate into this planning model was the amount of core area. Core area is just thinking about a patch. It's got a protective buffer around it. So the shape of the patch, the size of the patch, can have a lot to do with how efficient you're producing core area. So to do that in a modeling sense, that's not easy. Why? It's because these stands that we look on the landscape when we're talking about patches, we need to look at spatial interdependencies. When you try to do that at the landscape level, it's hard, and I don't know that there's any model out there today yet that can do that across the whole landscape all at once. So what we did is we came up with a sort of a moving windows GIS type analysis that we move these windows across, and we solve problems within each individual window. Here I'll just zoom in and show you how this process works. We're moving this window across the landscape. We're considering within that window some of the stands we're going to accept the management solution for, the ones that are away from an area left that we've analyzed. So we move this window across the forest, and we track and keep track of the amount of core area that we produce. Core area here, what the Forest Service was interested in, was core area of mature forests. We didn't look at core area of young stands. We're really looking at trying to build and looking at this patch size concern. And one of the things that the earlier speakers have brought up, well, what price do we put on core area? Well, what we did in that planning process is we just varied the price. We did a lot of what if type questions. What if we raise or lower that price in core area? Here we're looking at the response for the higher the graph, the higher value we put on core area. And a couple things that I to note on those. No matter what price level we picked, we could see how longer term those curves could go up. Why could they go up? Because we could plan ahead. We could look ahead and think about how are we going to arrange things spatially. We can also look at that and think, well, you know what? I don't think we've done much consideration yet about how we arrange things spatially. We talked a lot about age class distributions, targets for age classes, but in the past we really haven't done that.
To provide habitat, we consider wildlife needs.
Final study to talk about was we took this and we wanted to look at it more like an all lands approach, but we stepped back and said maybe we can't do all lands, but maybe we can just take 2 ownerships. Let's look at the idea of coordinating between Forest Service and DNR. Let's build off of what we did in Forest Service planning and look at how we might gain from that. Here, the map of an area that's really the Chippewa National Forest. You look at that pattern and you think, geez, look at those ownerships. We've got state land and federal land and those green and gold colors. Wouldn't make sense to coordinate that planning rather than each going off and doing their own plan separately, especially if we're concerned about things like wildlife and campsites. So what we did is we modeled those areas each separately, and then we did a joint analysis to see, oh, what could we gain by this coordination? We got at least one surprising result here. This is just looking at the amount of core area produced for different price levels. And just like what we saw in the Superior National Forest or the Chippewa National Forest, we raise the price of core area, we can get more of it over time. We can also see how even with constant price, by planning ahead, we can get more. We really haven't been planning for spatial arrangement in the past. Another one that I think is surprised us, we thought we would get these huge gains on sort of boots on the ground management coordination. What this slide shows is that we're really finding minimum gain from that. If we look at the gains from coordination, if we look at just the 2 right bars or 2 colors on the right here, one is looking at coordinated and one is looking at just adding the results together. We can explain why that happens when we go back and look at our GIS analysis. I don't want to get into that here, but in general, we were surprised at this outcome. We found one, I think, much more important answer. And we looked at this idea of how do we decide on values? How do we pick which options to use? And what this graph shows, we look at this red line curve. This is a frontier that's showing what are our potential of producing both timber and core area. And we'd like to operate someplace along that frontier. These blue points, all in between, in here that economists would say those are interior points or they're inferior points. Why? Because we should be out there along that frontier. Well, those points on the inside are cases where one agency uses one value or one price, and the other agency uses another. So when we look at that, that just seems like a real potential gain we have is looking at how we coordinate better in terms of that policy. We need to come to the table and talk about different agencies, talking about how do we find that balance and work together and collaborate. So I think that really fits what this group is interested in, and how do we take this to
I was
more
told it was
policy.
my duty. You can't make.
That's all I have. Did I make it in time?
Perfect. All right. So we have time for questions for Mark and Howard as professionals. So they can make Great. Any burning questions for these gentlemen? How their neighborhood is special? And then incentivize those things.
It's not burning, but back when we were doing the forest subsection plan on the North Shore, we grappled with how to integrate
Okay, we're gonna take a
ownerships
break
in
then.
watershed management for cold water streams. Could this same concept be used to look at that?
Well,
Where we've got county, state, and federal lands largely dominating that landscape. Could we use that concept to come up with a unified
I think
harvest?
potentially, I think it's coming back to how might agencies be treating them differently, how might they be mixing their value system, and whether we're talking about wildlife habitat or soil conditions or what, I think, it's working together, looking at how we integrate, and, it also comes back to how do we take this back to the ground? Are there aspects of that that might be very site-specific? And, the big gains that are not trying to do a coordinated, detailed site-level plan, but more of using similar value systems.
All right, we have a few minutes for other questions. This is your chance. In the back, Bruce.
Yes, did you notice anything in your data that kind of reflected forest insects and disease or windstorm, just natural disturbances, where there was some lift in some areas of that sort of conservation?
That's probably a better question for Mark, but, but in general, we started out with an inventory. I think we have a lot of questions about how to deal with that. I think some of it comes back to how much of that is taken into account in some of our empirical yield tables. When you look at empirical yield tables, everyone would, or many of the biometricians will come back and say, oh, that's really underestimating growth. We know it can grow better. But those empirical yield tables have some natural disturbance built into them. It comes back to more of things like, are we talking stand replacement type disturbance, or are we talking about, think of it as, maybe not very regular, but still damaging, but not replacing the whole stand. I think another area here that we really have to start thinking about would be fire. How do we do a better job of planning for fire? There's a lot that we don't know how to deal with in planning. And it takes a real team approach. It takes bringing expertise from different areas. And yeah, forestry community really needs to open up and listen to wildlife and look at what are these trade-offs. I think the role of an analyst is more of better understanding what a curve like this might look like and what your choices are. How do we come to the table and really put that value system on the best, what is the best solution? That's really a decision that needs to be made, I think, by some higher up, but they should be listening to input too.
So Howard, about 2 slides back, you mentioned that there was a minimal gain for collaboration. I'm
Yep.
interested in the context around that, because to me, a gain is a gain, potentially, and I'm wondering...
Okay, where we didn't see that at first, and we should have, was if you go back and you look at our GIS analysis and look at edges, and looking at the edges of stands, and how many stands are there out there that border, federal and state, versus how much are bordering a state stand bordering a state stand. And when you go through and you summarize the inventory that way, you get a very small percentage of the stands that are actually a federal stand up adjacent to a state stand. Where some of it could be misleading is how big of buffer distance do we want to talk about in core area. In our study, we maybe had a 1% gain out here by coordinating management out here on the far right, where we put heavy value on core area. But if we use a wider buffer distance, it would be different. And what's the appropriate buffer distance? I don't think I specified what buffer distance we used. We used for core area 150 feet. I've been to meetings where they've suggested, I think you should use for buffer distance 4 miles. Well, can you imagine what would happen if you tried to buffer stands 4 miles? No, but it's that difference between, what are we trying to measure and looking for help in terms of, input onto this. So yeah, I think we're moving in the right direction. We still only looked at one type of, or I shouldn't say that, we looked at differences between uplands and lowlands for core area. But we've just gotten sort of a start on the ability to go in and try to do some of this.
Okay, thank you. We're up for time for our break. If you have have other questions, you might be able to save them for our panel and open discussion at the end. So we'll be on break now till 10:15. We'll see you then.